There was a time when people didn't question what butter was. It came from cream, you churned it, you spread it on bread, you cooked with it. For thousands of years, that's what it was. And then, in less than a generation, it became the enemy. Not because it changed, because someone said it did. By the 1960s, butter had been pushed to the margins of the American diet. In its place came margarine, a product that had been illegal to sell as food in some states just decades earlier. It was marketed as progress, as science, as the responsible choice for anyone who cared about their heart. And people believed it. They believed it because doctors said so, because the American Heart Association said so, because the government put it in the dietary guidelines and the food pyramid. Butter was saturated fat, and saturated fat caused heart disease. That was the message. It was repeated so many times that it became truth. But it wasn't based on what butter had done. It was based on a hypothesis, one that had never been proven, and one that, over the following decades, would quietly fall apart. Margarine didn't come from farms. It came from factories. It started in the 1860s as a cheap substitute for butter, invented during a contest held by Napoleon III to feed his armies and the urban poor. The original recipe used beef tallow. Later versions used vegetable oils, cottonseed, soybean, corn. Oils that were liquid at room temperature and had to be chemically altered to become solid. The process was called hydrogenation. It involved heating the oil and forcing hydrogen gas through it under pressure in the presence of a metal catalyst. The result was a semi-solid fat that looked like butter, melted like butter, and could be stored without refrigeration. It also created something that didn't exist in nature: trans fats, a byproduct of the process, a molecular structure the human body had never encountered in significant amounts. By the 1950s, margarine consumption in the United States had surpassed butter. It was cheaper, it was shelf-stable, and increasingly it was seen as healthier. The logic was simple. It came from plants, not animals. It was unsaturated, not saturated, and it didn't have cholesterol. The fact that it was industrially produced, artificially colored, and contained synthetic fats didn't seem to matter. What mattered was the narrative. Butter was old, margarine was new, and new meant better. The case against butter began with a scientist named Ancel Keys. In the 1950s, Keys became interested in heart disease. Rates were rising in the United States, and he believed diet was the cause. Specifically, he believed that saturated fat raised cholesterol and that high cholesterol caused heart attacks. He published a paper in 1953 showing a strong correlation between fat consumption and heart disease across 6 countries. The graph was striking. The relationship appeared clear. The problem was that Keys had data from 22 countries. He chose 6. When the full dataset was analyzed later, the correlation disappeared. But by then, the hypothesis had momentum. Keys was charismatic, well-connected, and relentless. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. He sat on the American Heart Association's Nutrition Committee. He advised the government, and he pushed his theory with absolute certainty, dismissing critics and alternative explanations. Butter, eggs, red meat, all were implicated. The solution was to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, margarine, vegetable oils, processed spreads. The message was amplified through public health campaigns, medical advice, and food labeling. And so, butter was removed. Not by force, but by reputation. People stopped cooking with it, stopped buying it. Restaurants replaced it with margarine. School cafeterias did the same. It became something your grandparents used, something outdated, something dangerous. What replaced butter wasn't just margarine. It was an entire category of engineered fats, shortenings, spreads, non-dairy creamers, partially hydrogenated oils that appeared in bread, crackers, cookies, microwave popcorn, frozen dinners, coffee creamers, salad dressings, fried foods. They were everywhere because they were cheap, because they extended shelf life, because they didn't need refrigeration, because the industry that produced vegetable oils, originally a byproduct of cotton and soy farming, had found a new, massive market. The oils themselves weren't new. Cottonseed oil had been used in the late 1800s, mostly for industrial purposes. Crisco, the first shortening made from hydrogenated cottonseed oil, was introduced in 1911. But it wasn't until the campaign against saturated fat that these products became dietary staples. The language used to market them was deliberate: heart-healthy, cholesterol-free, light, better for you. The message wasn't just that margarine was an alternative, it was that it was superior. That choosing it was an act of care, of responsibility. And for decades, that's what people did. By the 1980s, trans fats were in nearly everything. No one called them that yet. They were just partially hydrogenated oils, listed in the ingredients, but not on the nutrition label. There was no requirement to disclose them, no public awareness of what they were or what they did. But researchers were starting to notice something. In the early 1990s, studies began showing that trans fats didn't just raise LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol. They also lowered HDL cholesterol, the good kind. They increased inflammation. They interfered with cell membrane function. They were worse for heart health than the saturated fats they had replaced. In 1993, a Harvard study estimated that trans fats were responsible for 30,000 deaths per year in the United States. Other studies suggested the number could be higher. The food industry knew. Internal documents later revealed that companies had conducted research on trans fats as early as the 1970s. They knew the risks, but they continued to use the oils because reformulating products was expensive, because the alternatives were less stable, because the public still believed margarine was healthy. It wasn't until 2006 that the FDA required trans fats to be listed on nutrition labels. Even then, companies were allowed to label products as having 0 grams if they contained less than half a gram per serving. A loophole, a technicality. By 2018, the FDA banned artificial trans fats entirely. But by then, people had been eating them for more than half a century. Butter didn't cause the heart disease epidemic. The studies that followed Keyes' hypothesis didn't prove what he claimed. Large, long-term trials found no consistent link between saturated fat and heart disease. Some found no effect at all. Others found that replacing saturated fat with refined carbohydrates, which is what many people did, actually increased risk. The 2010 meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition reviewed 21 studies involving nearly 350,000 people. It found no significant evidence that saturated fat increased the risk of heart disease or stroke. The 2014 meta-analysis in the Annals of Internal Medicine came to a similar conclusion. So did reviews in 2015 and 2017. The hypothesis that had driven public health policy for decades was falling apart. But the damage had been done. Butter had been villainized. An entire generation had grown up believing it was dangerous, and in its place, they had consumed oils and fats that were, by every measure, worse. Butter is just fat and milk solids. It contains vitamins A,
D, E, and K2, fat-soluble nutrients that the body needs and that are difficult to get from other sources. It contains butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that supports gut health and reduces inflammation. It contains conjugated linoleic acid, which has been studied for its potential anti-cancer properties. It's also calorie-dense, which is why it was valued historically. In cold climates, in times of scarcity, in diets that required physical labor, fat was not a problem, it was fuel. But in the mid-20th century, fat became something else. It became the explanation for a new kind of disease, a disease of abundance. And rather than questioning the broader changes in the food system, the rise of refined sugars, processed grains, seed oils, and industrially produced foods, the focus narrowed to a single macronutrient. Margarine didn't solve the problem, it created a new one. And by the time that became clear, millions of people had already been affected.
The story of butter is not just about butter. It's about how quickly a food can be redefined, how easily a tradition can be interrupted, how a scientific hypothesis repeated often enough becomes doctrine, and how an industry, given the right conditions, can replace something real with something engineered and call it progress. People trusted what they were told. They changed their diets. They bought the products. They believed they were making the right choice. And for a long time, no one asked what had been lost or what had been gained by the companies that sold the replacement. Butter came back eventually. Not all at once, not everywhere, but quietly over the last decade, it returned to kitchens, to recipes, to restaurant menus. The science shifted, the guidelines softened. Margarine lost its halo. But the decades in between are still there, in the bodies that consumed trans fats, in the hearts that were told to fear the wrong thing, in the meals that were cooked with oils that oxidized under heat, that broke down into compounds the liver had to process, that left a residue the body didn't know how to clear. You can't undo that. You can only see it for what it was. There are other foods that followed the same arc, other ingredients that were removed, replaced, rebranded. Other moments when the system decided what people should eat and people listened. This is just one of them.